What's up, everybody? This is Joe with J Blake Photo, and in today's video I want to talk about what I think is going to be the next flagship camera from Canon, a new mirrorless beast that I think we're going to get before next summer, and I want to go through the specs and I want to see what we might get. Okay, so first things first, big disclaimer. I have not spent a considerable amount of time with the 1DX Mark II. It's just not the kind of camera that I normally lay my hands on. It's primarily out of my price range. It's also really just not the camera for the kind of projects that I'm working on. I also want to say off the bat that other than the rumors that most of you can probably find on the internet, I do not have a considerable amount of new information or rumors or details from insiders at Canon. What I have is the ability to review the history, the cameras that we do have, and what I think Canon is going to be doing in this class, in this tier of camera release. So having said that, what I want to do is I want to kind of go through and talk about what this new camera might be. So first of all, right now, the top of the heap in the Canon lineup is the 1DX Mark II, which is a DSLR that came out almost 4 years ago. This camera is already feeling very long in the tooth, and we're going to talk a little bit about that when we go through it. When I say go through it, what I mean is I want to take the specs of the 1DX Mark II and put them side by side with the current flagship of Canon's mirrorless line, the EOS R. Now, you might think, well, that's not much of a flagship, but right now it's the top-end camera from Canon in a mirrorless body. If we know that somewhere down the line we're going to get a new camera from Canon at the top end, they have to replace the aging 1DX. And we know that we're going to try and get it, or they're going to try and get it to us before the Summer Olympics in 2020. They're going to need a couple of months of lead time. They're going to need review units. They're going to need demos. They're going to need all this stuff to get out there. And so I honestly think that we might see this thing by Christmas 2019, or at the latest, maybe January or February of 2020. So with that, I wanted to take a look at the specs of the 1DX Mark II. I wanted to compare them to the specs of the EOS R, and then use that information based on what we know about Canon's history and their flagship cameras and what they do with new camera releases versus maybe what the market or the people like me on YouTube really want them to do. And we're going to take a look and see if we can't kind of figure out the math and determine what we're going to see next. All right, so we're going to be comparing the 1DX Mark II to the EOS R, and then we're going to go through in each category and try and figure out what we think the 1DX Mark III, the 1DX R, the RX, the RDX, whatever they're going to call it, and we're going to try and figure out what this thing might have in it, what we might want in it, and really what's going to be realistic in terms of what Canon's going to be releasing. So first, let's go through the specs on the 1DX. So at the top end, we've got the 20.2 megapixel sensor. Now, this is not an extremely dense sensor in terms of pixel count. This camera is specifically designed for super high-end sports and for wildlife photography. So because of that, there's a lot of times where you might need to really kind of boost up the exposure on a photo. You're not going to have full control over the lighting in that environment. And so sometimes resolution is not your top priority, but your dynamic range and your ability to really recover shadows. And the 20 megapixel sensor with the larger pitch of these pixels allows you to do a little bit more of that. But a little bit more on that kind of stuff as we get through. So it actually has the Digic 6 Plus. It actually has two of them. And the Digic 6 Plus is an enhancement on the Digic 6, and they slap two of them on there to improve processing speed. This is all about speed. So the 7D and the 1DX are the cameras that Canon chooses to put dual chips in. This does a couple of things. Number one, it significantly increases the price of the camera. It increases the heat and power draw on the camera, but it also significantly improves the speed of the camera. And this particular camera has dual card slots. It's got a CF card and a CFast card. Moving on to the EOS R, and we've got that 30.3 megapixel sensor that is taken directly from the 5D Mark IV. So 10 more megapixels than the 20.2 that we have in the 1DX Mark II. It's a significant improvement. It's 66% more. Through improvements in their sensor technology and also in their processing capabilities, we actually get really great low light performance, equal to, if not better than, the 1DX Mark II. DxO Mark has it scored at a 13.5 stop dynamic range. We'll talk about that in a later slide, but these two cameras really are about the same. You're looking at the difference between an improvement in sensor technology over the years. But the EOS R is hit with a reduction here. This is where you start to see the difference between the top of the line shooter and a mid-range shooter. Is it does have the Digic 8 processor, which does bring improvement in the camera's capabilities, but it does reduce the speed because it doesn't have those dual chips that are designed to really just kind of fly through those shots. And it does not have dual card slots. This is another thing that really differentiates the EOS R and the 1DX Mark II as being the pro model and the not so pro model, is the fact that the EOS R comes with a single card slot, and it is an SD card slot, not a CFast card, though it is UHS 2, which is an improvement over previous models. So now, looking at these statistics, let's talk about what we think we might see in terms of the quick overview in a 1DX Mark III or a DXR or an RX. And first things first, I think we're going to see about 35 megapixels. I don't think they're going to push this particular sensor a lot further than that. Again, this is not going to be a studio camera in the vein of the 5DS, 5DR. This is going to be a replacement for the 1DX against sports and wildlife shooting, which means that they really want to continue that line of having great dynamic range, which they're going to get with more megapixels, but not just blowing it out of the water with something like 50 or 60 or 70 megapixels. The pitch depth on those pixels is just not going to be enough to allow them to absorb the light in a way that would allow for recovery and high dynamic range. So I think we're going to see about 35 megapixels. Again, it's got to be an improvement over the previous model, but I don't think it's going to be huge. I think we're going to see the Digic 8 again. I think they're going to tweak it. I think they're going to improve it. I don't think they need to come out with a whole new architecture, and I think we're going to see two of them. Take the Digic 8, improve the process on it, maybe do a die shrink, maybe add some additional technologies into it, and then slap two of them together. Next, you're still going to have that 1/8000th max shutter speed, and last but not least, I definitely think this is going to be a pro camera. This is a 1DX replacement. It's going to need dual card slots. And while I would love to say that it's going to have two CFast cards, for some reason this is the type of place where Canon is just going to give us just a little bit less than we want. I can feel it. So I think we're going to end up with a CFast and an SD with a UHS 2 slot. Right, so now moving on from our kind of top-down specs, the things that you see maybe on the box in terms of feature list. Now let's talk about how fast this thing is going to be. So the 1DX Mark II, it has 14 to 16 frames per second raw, and that is 14 through the viewfinder up to 16 using live view, which is actually an interesting detail when you think about the fact that the live view on the 1DX Mark II is powered by dual pixel AF that you have powering the entire autofocus system inside the EOS R. The 1DX Mark II will shoot up to 170 RAWs before it fills up its buffer. And to compare that with the EOS R, the Canon spec sheet shows 8 FPS RAW. Now we know that that's with continuous AF. We also know that that is not super kind of lock on. If you were to switch it to some of the other autofocus modes, you're going to get closer to 5. From what I've seen on most reviews, it's closer to 3 or 4. This is not a fast camera in terms of frames per second, but we know that. It does have a 47 shot RAW buffer, and if you switch from RAW or CR2 into C-RAW or Canon RAW 3, CR3, you actually end up with closer to 73 RAW files in a burst with CR3. So if we extrapolate that information and we look at what we're going to see in a 1DX3, in a 1DX R, or a RX, I think they're going to leverage the speed that you can actually get out of those dual processors and a big buffer on this camera, as well as the write speed that you can get with CFast. And I think that we're going to get a really high number here in terms of its ability to shoot. Again, this is going to be at the Olympics. This is going to be wildlife. You need to have those high FPS to get the job done in those super professional environments when you are a photographer for Sports Illustrated, for National Geographic. That's what you need. I think we're going to see a gigantic raw buffer on this camera, something like 250 raw files. And I think if you were to incorporate the CR3, the Canon RAW 3, into this camera, and switch into that mode, you're going to end up with 300 to 350 raw files. The one thing to remember, though, is that the CR3, it is a lossy format, which means that it is doing some compression. It is dropping some of the information out of the file to make it smaller, and that's how it's able to record faster. It's how it's able to fill the buffer up slower. It's because it's ditching some of the information out of the image. From every review that I've seen of CR3, it is very good, but I don't know how much pros firing off with this camera are going to be using it. That'll kind of be something that we need to see, and they might make tweaks to the camera to improve this process along the way. So we might actually see some huge advantages in terms of speed and in terms of buffer size, while also retaining a lot of detail in the raw images. All right, moving on to autofocus points. The 1DX Mark III comes with 61 autofocus points, 41 of which are cross-type. And you've also got to remember that the 1DX and the 1DX Mark II is a DSLR. So the light is coming into the lens, and then it's actually bouncing up through the pentaprism. And when you see it in your eye, it's also bouncing up to the autofocus sensor, which is a separate sensor than the one that's actually on the back of your camera. In the mirrorless version, or the mirrorless cameras, that is not the case. So every bit of light that you see on the screen through the viewfinder on a mirrorless camera is also being seen by the sensor, and is also being seen by the autofocus system. So the 1DX Mark II will focus up to -3 EV, so pretty dark, not pitch black, but pretty dark. And it does have dual pixel AF in live view mode, so when you're not looking through the viewfinder. With the EOS R, we've got 5,600 autofocus points. Again, I mentioned a huge portion of the sensor itself is actually responsible for focusing, and everything is just pointed right on that sensor. There's no pentaprisms, there's no mirrors, there's no process of having to split that light. Everything is being handled on that sensor. So you've got over 5,600 autofocus points. They go from top to bottom, side to side. Here's where it gets crazy. You've got -6 EV focusing. That means that when you hit the button and you meter your shot, right? You want to get that number right around 0, so you're looking at, what you're actually looking at is what you can see with the eye. The fact that it will focus down to 6 stops, 6 times darker than what you actually are looking at is just amazing. Now, of course, it has dual pixel AF. That's all it has, is dual pixel AF, because that's the focusing system on a mirrorless camera. So if we transition over to a high-end flagship camera, let's talk about what we think we're going to get out of this flagship camera in the focusing department. And I think that this is going to be really impressive. I think we're going to get over 7,000 focusing points. I think they're really going to wow with this number. They might even go crazy and push it up to something like 10,000. But if they've got a sensor that's big enough, if they got processors that can handle it, I see no reason why they wouldn't be able to push over 5,000, 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 autofocus points and just go crazy with it. I think the sensor capability, again, because they're pushing it to 35 or 40 megapixels, I think you're still going to see about -6 EV on the low light focusing. Of course, it's still going to have dual pixel AF, which I'm sure they'll tweak and improve, probably add IAF. I actually think that they might add some additional capabilities for the camera to better identify subjects and movement and certain scenarios to help the photographer focus better. To see, okay, are we looking at a runner? Are we looking at a bird? Are we looking at a landscape? Are we looking at a car? And have some of that AI generated kind of quick action focus capability built into the camera. I think that that'll be in there, and I think that that will be aided by the fact that it'll have just a ton of autofocus points. All right, so next we'll talk about low light performance and sensitivity on the sensor. The 1DX Mark II has a native ISO up to 51,200, but of course it's expandable to a low end of 50 and a super high end of over 400,000. It's got 13.5 stops of dynamic range at ISO 100. And we see similar numbers out of the EOS R. 40,000 is the top range ISO for this camera natively, but again, expandable down to 50 and expandable at the top end up to 100,000 with pretty much the same 13.5 stops of dynamic range. So what I think we'll see out of the 1DX Mark III or this RX series camera to be probably about a doubling of the native ISO. I think we'll see about a 100K native ISO, but of course expandable to probably up to about 800,000, 800K ISO with a high expansion. And again, I think this is something here where they're really going to wow us with numbers. I know we are always talking about new features and new specs, but I think we're going to see some of the specs that we're used to seeing just bumped up further and further and further. I think we're going to see closer to 15 stops of dynamic range on this camera over the 13.5 that we've been seeing for the last 4 or 5 years out of the top-end cameras in Canon's lineup. All right, so let's talk about video features. I know that a lot of people like to look at this camera as a video option. Canon doesn't see it that way. They don't want you buying this camera for video. It has video capabilities as a secondary kind of backup, which I know a lot of people will think, well, the 5D Mark II's video capabilities are really what kind of set off this revolution in DSLR video for the common man. But Canon really doesn't want that. If you're going to spend thousands of dollars on a camera and you want to do video, they want you to buy their cinema cameras. That's what they want you to do. They want you to buy the C500, the C300, the C100, the C200 Mark II. Those are the cameras that they want you to be buying. And so they're not going to give you every single thing that you want out of this camera. So as we go down and we talk about what the 1DX Mark II has and how it's somewhat crippled in the video department, and then we talk about the EOS R and talk about how it is somewhat crippled in the video department, anyone who thinks that when we get to a super high-end new camera that it is not going to be slightly crippled in the video department, I'm not sure you're paying attention when it comes to Canon. This is just what they're going to do, and I think we should just get used to it. So the 1DX Mark II, as we all know, it does shoot in 4K. It shoots 4K at 60 frames a second, which is great for the size of the sensor that it has. Unfortunately, there are a couple of caveats there. Number one, it shoots the entire thing in MJPEG, which is not a video format. It is gigantic. 4 gigabytes is something like 39 seconds on that particular format. It only shoots in full 4K. It doesn't shoot in UHD. There's no other formats that you can shoot in, and it doesn't record audio. So there you go. There's your 4K 60 out of the 1DX Mark II. Now it's 800 megabits a second, so the quality of the footage is really phenomenal, but man, I hope that you have a workflow ready to take on that kind of bandwidth. Also, it's cropped. It's not a crazy crop, it's 1.3, but that just means that the processors on that camera cannot handle a full pixel readout out of that sensor and convert it into 4K fast enough to handle the 60 frames per second that's coming off the camera. Now it does have a super slow-mo 120 frame per second mode at 1080p. However, and that's not in MJPEG, that's actually in MPEG, but it also doesn't record audio. So you got to have an external audio recorder if you intend on using that footage for anything other than B-roll. Although it is wonderful for B-roll, it's 480 megabits a second. It's phenomenal. Now the EOS R does shoot 4K. It shoots it in 30 frames per second with a whopping 480 megabits per second, which is wonderful. And it doesn't use MJPEG. So we've solved all of our problems. It also shoots with audio encoded in the video stream. So again, problem solved, right? Wrong. The EOS R, again, because it doesn't have the processing power to handle an entire pixel readout of the sensor, is cropped at 1.7. So take your widest lens and multiply that number by 1.7. That makes my widest lens about 30 millimeters, which is not super wide. So a lot of people have complained about the crop on this camera and that it really does cripple it for 4K video. It does shoot 1080p at 60 frames per second without a crop, and it has a weird 720p 120 frames per second mode that is pretty fuzzy, and the codec on it is not very good. Okay, so we've got the 1DX Mark II that is has some serious shortcuts, some serious dings in the armor. You've got the EOS R that a lot of people were disappointed in for its 4K capabilities, and then you're going to have this new flagship camera that is not primarily designed for video. So here's what I think we're going to get. I think we're definitely going to get 4K 60. I think we're definitely going to get it at a super high bit rate. I think something like 600 megabits per second. And I do think that it's going to come straight to MPEG. I don't think we're going to be dealing with MJPEG anymore. I think those days are done. I think it'll have audio built in. I think it'll be a phenomenal codec. I think it's going to look great. I think it's going to have Canon's log flat profile, the C-Log profile built into the camera. I think there's going to be some really cool stuff there, and I don't think we're going to have a crop. So I just got done telling you that this camera is probably going to be crippled in the video department, and now it almost looks like I'm telling you it's not. So here's what I'm saying. This camera coming out in 2019, late 2019, early 2020, with just 4K at 60 frames a second for thousands of dollars and being a flagship camera, mirrorless or not, 4K is too low. 4K is not going to be enough to make people happy. There will be people that are going to be pissed that this thing is 4K. The fact that it's not 5 or 6 or 8K. Canon has an 8K camera. We just saw it at WWDC recently. It was shooting 8K. It is unreleased. It is not a DSLR. It is a C series cinema camera. They just haven't announced it yet, but we know that it's coming. If you want to shoot 8K, that's what you need to get, or a Red or something like it. So even though they're fixing all the mistakes that they made with previous cameras, they're not moving anything forward. But it's still going to be sweet and make amazing video. I think we might also see a 4K at 120. But I think that will have a crop or some other thing that's going to reduce its capability, because I think the camera's going to have a hard time dealing with that kind of throughput. Okay, so now moving past video features, we need to talk about the thing that really kind of sets the 1DX, the 1D line apart. And that's just those kind of intangible features, the things that make the camera the one you need. The things that make it uncompromised. And that's not about video, and that's not even really about speed. It's about those extra features. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So the 1DX has a 1.6 million dot touch screen. It's 3.2 inches. Really the only thing that you can do to on it when you touch it is modify the focus points. It also doesn't pop out and tilt. But this camera is covered in buttons and dials and switches and all these different kinds of things that really make it intangible, that really make it one of those things that you're just like, yeah, this is what I need. I need to have that one button at the ready all the time. It's got USB 3.0, which is pretty much standard now. Weirdly, so it has a mini HDMI port, but the mini HDMI port does not export anything other than 1080p. Again, this is a 4-year-old camera. They were not intending it to be a studio video camera for live streaming. So I'm not really sure why people think that it should have 4K out. Again, this is not what that camera's for. If you want that camera, buy a cinema camera. They have a line for that. But the output was 1080p only. It also didn't have Wi-Fi, it didn't have Bluetooth, it didn't have any of those additional features, which now are pretty much table stakes. The EOS R came and actually fixed a lot of these problems. A lot of the things that we have issues with on the 1DX now that maybe we didn't when it first came out, but a lot of the things were fixed when the EOS R came out. It does have a tilt flip 3.15 inch 2+ million dot display with a 70 degree vari angle adjustment. It doesn't have a lot of the same buttons and switches and things like that, and that's because of its size, but it does have a programmable touch bar or slide bar or whatever, multifunction bar on the top. And you also have the adjustable ring on the lenses and the adapters that come for this camera. It's got USB 3.1, which now, again, is standard. It also has mini HDMI out, but that mini HDMI out actually supports 4K, and not just 4K, but a clean 422 signal, which is very nice. And it's got Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and both of them have GPS. So if we look at those stats and we say, okay, really, the EOS R as a consumer camera really brought things up to another level in terms of those intangible things, we have to expect that the flagship camera is going to have all of that stuff and more, and I think it will. I think we're going to see some really great stuff here. Starting with a nice, big, gorgeous display. I think it's going to have a 3.2 inch, maybe 2.3 million dot, just high contrast, really great screen. I don't think that it's going to be tilt, very angle like the 6D and the EOS R. I just don't think Canon wants to do that with their Pro shooter. So I don't think that we're going to see the very angled display there. I think they're going to expect you to attach maybe an external monitor for that kind of thing. I think we're going to get a lot of customization options in terms of the buttons and the controls. And I think we're going to see more things like that touch bar, like that multifunction bar that we saw in the EOS R. Hopefully they improve it a little bit. I know people were touching it with their nose and their cheeks when they were trying to focus with that camera, but I think that was a Gen 1, and I think we're going to see some improvements over time. Here's where I think they're going to do something really interesting. I would love to see maybe a row of 3 or 4 USB-C 3.1, 3.2 ports with multifunction capability. Maybe one of them or any one of them could support video out at 4K, maybe better than 422 for external recording. Maybe 4K at 120 so that you can record it externally without a crop. In addition to maybe other audio video out options, the 1DX Mark II has an Ethernet jack. Maybe you can plug in a USB-C dongle and plop in an Ethernet port to it. I think that would be actually really cool to be able to customize the different things that you had attached to your camera for things like tethered shooting, for remote control, for video out, for all sorts of stuff, and really piggyback on the capability of the USB interface. Instead of having 10 different kinds of ports, this USB and that headphone and this, that, and HDMI and just throw a bunch of USB 3s on there, 3 USB-Cs that can do everything. I think it'll definitely have Wi-Fi, it'll definitely have Bluetooth, NFC, and GPS built in. Okay, so last but not least, price. So the 1DX Mark II MSRP is for $5,500. Right now you can get one on Amazon for about $4,500. Don't buy one right now for $4,500. You're throwing your money away. The EOS R just had a price cut. It's now down to $19.99. I actually saw it on a 4th of July sale for $1,600 on Amazon, which is really great. But the real question is, what are we going to see in this new camera? And I think this is where Canon is really going to try and shoot for a good middle area of the market. And I think that we're going to see this camera at about $5,000. I think at $49.99, I think it really kind of hits the right tone for Canon. It is still a flagship camera. It's still top of the line. It gives them room to maybe come up with a more advanced or different flavor of this camera if they wanted to, for maybe a little bit more similar to how they did with the 5D Mark IV. But I really do think that they need to hit the right price point. And I think $7,000 is too high. I just don't think, considering what they're going to be releasing feature-wise, that it's going to be what everyone's looking for at that high a price point. I just don't think that they can really deliver anything that people wouldn't look at and say, yeah, that's not for me, or I'm going to wait for that next version. So I'm really excited to see this camera. I think we're going to see it towards the end of this year, early next year. And these are the specs that I'm really expecting to see out of it. I'm going to keep really close track of this. And when we do get more rumors or announcements, I'm going to release another video where we kind of compare these specs that we've kind of prognosticated and kind of see how close we were. Maybe we'll get a dartboard and see how close we were to some of those specs. I'd love to know what you think and what is the feature that you are dying to see in a 1DX Mark III in a mirrorless 1D series camera. So go ahead and throw that in the comments. What is the #1 feature that you're looking for or want to see? Now, I said at the top of the video that I do not shoot with the 1DX. So you might ask, well, why the heck do I care? It's because honestly, as the flagship of the line, it pushes everything else forward. It also pushes the market forward with the competitors around it like Nikon and Sony and Fuji and Pentax and all these other guys. It really pushes them to do more. So like I said, let me know what you think in the comments. Go ahead and hit the like button if you like videos like this. Go ahead and hit the subscribe button if you are not already. And go ahead and hit the little bell. Lets you know when I've got new videos coming out, which is about once a week or so. And thanks a ton for watching, and I will see you in the next video.